and welcome to my first lesson here of financial astrology, but also how we can use money in our own lives. Astrology is a fantastic tool to give us an insight to some of the astrological transits that we have been born into, where we bring some free will. It's very important that we do not rely on our astrology chart to think that is the be all and end all of how our life is going to become, but we certainly can have a look at some of the astrological patterns or the placements of the planets when we were born and how they might give us a bit of a look into perhaps why we were, say, born into money. Maybe we have money, but it has come with a little bit of a price. To some, we may look rich on the outside, but we feel poor on the inside. Sometimes we struggle with money. Sometimes we have someone in our family that's very rich and powerful, but has made our childhood really harsh. And often when we have situations like this, or there is a money theme in our life, or we'd even like to look by transit, when we might have better money periods than others, we certainly want to look at three of the money planets. And they are Pluto, Jupiter, and the Sun. The way they connect in astrology is really quite important to the themes of money. Now we can use that in our lives, in the financial markets, when we are doing client consultations, if you are talking to people, because often people do come to us when they're having money issues. So if you are interested in yourself and money, the very first thing I would suggest to do is take a look at Jupiter, Pluto, and the Sun in our charts. Now we know Jupiter is the planet of abundance. By transit or in our charts, often we look to it as the great benefactor, or when we might have better times of prosperity, how our chart is set up and how money works for us. Some people have Jupiter retrograde. I have it myself. One thing I will say here is sometimes when we have Jupiter retrograde, we do have to be very careful when we are looking at Jupiter transits, and we have to be very careful not to get married to an outcome. Now, this does not work for everyone, but speaking on social media to people and from my experience, sometimes a Jupiter transit, when we have a retrograde Jupiter or even a retrograde Pluto, I'll come there later, we just can't really rely on this transit because the Jupiter is working a little weak in our chart. However, when we have the combination of Jupiter, Pluto, and the Sun, it actually does not matter so much when we're looking at the overall themes of our life and money, whether Pluto or Jupiter is retrograde or direct, because they are there and they may connect in our chart. Now, you would probably expect that they have to be connected positively. This is not actually the case. Now, we use this in the financial markets just as much as we use it in our life, but this is about us and our money. This combination of planets can actually connect, whether it be trine or sextile or even conjunct, which are quite positive. A conjunction is going to give a very, very interesting story and probably quite poignant, particularly Pluto and the Sun, but they actually can connect in negative aspect when it comes to money. They can be square, sextile, or opposite. So I'm going to show you here and give you a bit of a look if you sort of don't quite understand this and think, how do these connect? If we have a look at the first slide, what we have is a Jupiter opposite Sun. Then if you are familiar with astrology, we look at the bottom. We have what is called Pluto square Sun, Pluto square Jupiter. Now these will actually, if you know astrology, form a T-square. So that is a harsh area in our charts. I'm going to come there later and show you on a chart. What this does, it's when we have a pattern like this, is set up a really interesting situation, often to do with money. And I'm going to come to that later. If we look at the second example, we have a really positive combination. Sometimes we have what's called even a two-way. I haven't quite put it in here because I don't want to make it too complicated, but sometimes even in both ways, Pluto, Jupiter, and the Sun can go a diagonal and horizontal. This example, we have Jupiter sextile the Sun, Pluto trine the Sun. And when we look to the third example, we have actually the connect. And this is really important. This is what a lot of people don't really understand. We can even have a semi-square here. Here we have Jupiter semi-square the Sun. We have Pluto semi-square the Sun, and we have Pluto square Jupiter. So that's a little bit of that two-way I've brought in here. They are connected. Even through a semi-square, the fact is that they're connecting. When we have the positive aspects, interestingly, that actually can come into our astrology and come out a little bit differently, because sometimes when we have areas of tension, we have these sort of challenges that we overcome. Now, that obviously will depend if we are born into a money type situation or if we create our own money. So I'm going to show you that on a chart. This is a chart of the first example I've shown you. Here we can see we have the Sun at 29 degrees. We have Pluto at 29 degrees, and we have Jupiter at 3 degrees. So when Jupiter is, say, probably within about 5 degrees, or any planet within 5 degrees, that will allow us still enough room to create, whether it be a trine, sextile, square, whichever. Now, I don't know if you can see it here, but we have what we would call Jupiter opposite the Sun. And here we have Pluto squared Jupiter, and we have Pluto square the Sun. So what that does, and if you can see a bit of a triangle, there's a few what we would call T-squares on this chart, but this sets up this really interesting pattern of tension. Now, this is a client that I know, and so I knew that I could run this chart. We keep everything confidential in astrology. And in this example, this client actually has been born into a money type situation. However, the money is there, but it has come through, probably might not be the most, greatest set of circumstances in life, but it's certainly there. For example, in this chart, we have Pluto in the second house. So what we can do is we look to our clients' charts and we look at the second house, and when we have a really large outer planet there often can be a story. But the point is here that there is some sort of abundance, and when we use Pluto in astrology, and we do have this type of, study of astrology, known as evolutionary astrology. So particularly when we come into this sort of Pluto in the second house, and we would of course look at our nodes, which I've got them in here, but I'm not going to sort of talk about that now. What it is that sometimes we can connect these really big stories of sort of the why we're here and why things happen. We have this Jupiter opposite the Sun. Now what this does is it sets up this sort of tension. And what sometimes happens is that we work with all these challenges when we have what we call these T-squares, or area of challenges and tension, and we can even be quite successful ourselves. Often there are a lot of people that have these kind of setups that have really been pushed through family, that they are no good if they aren't making money. This Pluto kind of comes in and money starts coming into this really different situation. However, the fact that they're all connected does give us interesting combinations and stories and themes to do with money. So one other thing in your own chart, even if you do have, if you're getting in a reading with an astrologer that's quite early into astrology, they might kind of tell you it's a bad thing. They're definitely harder to work with when we're younger. However, as we become older, we really start to accrue a lifetime of working with these situations where we absolutely are able to rise over these challenges and turn them into success. So this is just one example, and it's because I know a date and I've asked permission. They said I can use it without their name here. So this is the setup of Pluto, Jupiter, and the Sun. And we would think that's really negative and that there may not be money in this person's life. But when we put one of these Pluto, Jupiter, Sun, and we don't even have to put them in a money house, we could certainly put them, say, in an eighth house or in the fifth house, which rules our, is a lot to do with speculation and shorter term investments. I'm going to do another series on the houses and stuff to do with our money and our astrology. But it's really important to start with Pluto, Jupiter, and the Sun. We are always the Sun in our chart. Jupiter is the great benefactor. Now, here I actually wanted to use this example because Jupiter is retrograde. And we sort of, as I mentioned before, bring in stories to do with retrograde planets. Certainly, and sometimes when things are a little bit too easy, say when we have this sort of sextile and trine setup that's really, really positive, sometimes what happens is that things come to us quite easily when we're young and we become a little lax. I won't say lazy, but because things come easily, we are expecting it to come easily all our life. So sometimes these areas of tension actually make us quite successful. And it's really important to understand that in astrology. And it really helps you understand your chart. And when we think of our lives and so on, that as long, it's about the connection of the planets. We are the Sun, Jupiter is the benefactor. Now, it's not to say Pluto is always about money, but in a kind of financial astrology sense, we do kind of give it that kind of weight. Now, there can be a person in our lives who is very Pluto. Maybe they have money, or they are, they live their life all about money. But there also can be things like big businesses. We may even work for really large corporations when there is a Pluto. Maybe we've got Pluto in the 10th. We might be someone that's a real go-getter, and work is kind of the most important thing to us, and we really want to rise to the top or have a very big successful business. I'm going to show you a chart here. This is a chart of Bill Gates. Now, I probably don't need to say too much here because everyone knows knows who Bill Gates is and about money. We have what's called the Pluto-Jupiter conjunction. This is equally as important in money astrology or financial astrology because Pluto conjunct Jupiter is a very, very big money combination. It's even in his second house here of finances. They are direct, they are strong, and Pluto conjunct Jupiter is all about money. I'm going to show you actually another chart as well. Here's another chart. This time we have Kris Jenner, Kim Kardashian's mother, another person that is all about money. And what do we have? Again, the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction in the second house. It is a really, really, really strong setup for money. Now, in this situation, this is actually, well, both really, they're self-made. So it is not to say that we have to have these connections by birth for us to have money. Often there is just the drive to make money and actually a very good ability to make money. Now I'm going to go a little bit off that. We can actually see here that these two are connected to Neptune. And interestingly, this Neptune is in the 4th house, and she made a television show about her family. And Neptune actually rules things like reality TV. Think about Neptune and reality. So what you can actually do is start looking at some of these people or your own chart and actually really look how the Pluto connects. Interestingly, there is a really interesting link I have seen through working with clients with Pluto and this Neptune as well. Now, when we have this Pluto Jupiter, we get that extra little bit of success from it. But even Pluto connected to things like Neptune, I have really, interesting songwriters, astrologers. People can kind of start to think about, can we make money through spirituality with this kind of Pluto Neptune? That's something quite different. Well, we might even go there later. But at the moment, this is about Pluto, Jupiter, and the Sun. It does help a lot when these planets are direct. It comes out in a slightly different way. You can see here, not necessarily everything is, fantastic on this chart. However, the Pluto conjunct Jupiter. Now, when we have, I'll now go back to Bill Gates' chart so we can just have a look a little bit at that as well. See here, when you actually look at this chart, there isn't really anything too fantastic. Now, I will just point out, now Bill Gates and Kris Jenner are born around the same year, totally different places, different months. This is quite interesting, the Neptune connected as well. What does Neptune rule? Pharmaceuticals. Anyway, just putting it out there. So this is really, really interesting. But when we look at a chart like this, we look at these kind of, the transits and how the planets are connected. And it's actually really only the Pluto Jupiter, and look, we might even say the Pluto Neptune where we're at now, but that's taken Bill Gates all of his life to go there. This is really the only thing on this chart that shows us something to do with money. Has he got Jupiter connected? Well, only to this sort of Neptune Pluto. And I can't express enough how Pluto Jupiter is really the money combination. And then we bring in the sun because we're talking about us and money. Now, this is not the only way we need to connect this astrology. I'm going to show you another way. Sometimes when we're looking at charts as astrologers, it is not necessarily just via transit when we can see someone and their money. If you have a program which will allow you to look at what we call midpoints, and this is also to look at your own astrology, of course, I really, really, really suggest to have a flip over here. And what we want to do is see if we can connect Jupiter, Pluto, and the Sun. Now, this may take a little bit of fiddling, and sometimes we don't even get it right the first time. We actually, you might not see it, but once we start moving our wheel around, we might see a few different sets of combinations. And I'm going to show you one because sometimes we can bring a lot of other planets in as well. The idea is we just need to connect all three. This is a chart of Michael Saylor, who is the world's biggest Bitcoin investor. Now, when I showed it to you here, you can see here's the sun at 15 degrees and here's this Pluto at 15 degrees. When we look at it here, they're not necessarily connected, and this is sort of why I want to show you it this way. Obviously, we've got, we have this Jupiter square sun, we have like a Pluto opposite moon, there's all these sort of different transits. But on face value, we're not necessarily connecting in the chart. We certainly have a Jupiter square sun. I will just point out, Jupiter square sun is not always bad for finance. It's one of those few squares in astrology where it actually can be quite a good money transit. It's a sort of case by case, but generally we can look at it that. But when we had Jupiter square Pluto, Jupiter square the sun by transit, that becomes something quite different. But what I want to show you here, now for example, how we do that, see if I sort of go between this sort of Jupiter sun, we don't really get anything. And then even if I went between his Pluto Jupiter, what I've got to do, here we go, I've just got to come in a little bit here because it was a little bit tricky to put these two together, I seem to remember. Where are we? I've got to just get it in here, bear with me for a moment. I've got it together here. So here we can see we actually bring some other planets in here. Now, for example, how we brought in Uranus, and it's really interesting that Michael Saylor is really heavily invested in crypto, and it's a really big story for his life. And here comes another planet come in. It's not really about that stuff, but it's really interesting when we can look at clients or our own charts this way. So here we have the connect, Jupiter, Pluto, and the Sun. It just takes, sometimes it took me even just doing this here, a little bit of playing around, and here we go. You may even think that there's something to do with Chiron here. It's not where I'm going to go right now. So that is an example of where we don't necessarily see it at face value. Now, because when we do see this Pluto, Jupiter, and the Sun, and particularly even Pluto square Sun, I'll have a talk about that for a moment. I'll just bring a chart up here. often when we have Pluto Sun, and I will just bring this in because it is a little bit about money and us, Pluto Sun can often, you may probably would know this as an astrologer, often we see really, I guess we'd say interesting family dynamics. They're usually not that pleasant for the client, and they do often come with themes of people that throw their power around a little bit too much. We probably do know, and I want to make this about money. Sometimes people do see early death when we have Pluto Sun, but it's not always that. There is often quite a family dynamic, and many times that story will involve either money itself or someone not feeling they're good enough because they don't make enough money. They're being told by people in their family they're not, money might equal love, things like that. So that's just kind of one way we can look at that. Now, I will show you something. This is actually just about, I'm going to put one little bit of financial astrology in here, but this is really about us. But I just kind of want to show another really interesting example. This is a chart of Elon Musk's Tesla. It is probably one of the harder charts if this were a person, and you could certainly look at someone born in 29th of June 2010. We have what this Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, and there will be another slide on Uranus because Uranus is also a really big financial planet. Here is this Pluto opposite Sun, another Pluto Sun. Now, I'm just going to mention this because sometimes with Pluto, now we've got a retrograde Pluto here. We do have a direct Jupiter. And as I have said, the Jupiter and whether it is direct or retrograde, just in our own lives and our charts and so on. Look at this in the 8th house of other people's money as well. I'll just put it out there. But the Pluto retrograde, now that kind of can bring in our stories with Pluto. And in this case, it's something like the SEC. Because when we are looking at Pluto, Jupiter and the Sun, Pluto entities are actually quite important because that is our big business. Hedge funds are Pluto. Someone like a Warren Buffett is Pluto. Pluto is often about money. Now we have this Sun opposition here, and Pluto opposite Sun is really tough in the money stuff because say you want to incorporate a business, you absolutely do not want to have Pluto opposite Sun. Wait. It's really a matter of days here, but because we're talking about ourselves and money, if you are ever interested in doing business, I really suggest not to have a Sun opposite Pluto because often you can get into a lot of trouble. Now, in this case, the trouble came through the hedge funds were really not a fan of Elon Musk and were constantly what we call short selling his stock. They were betting on it to go down more than up. It caused a lot of problems in the beginning. And even though this is actually a lucky combination, so even though we have this lucky combination, we had a really long period of problems. So when you are starting a business, you certainly don't want to come and bring it in with a lot of problems. However, and here you can see the Pluto opposite Sun, and actually Pluto squared Jupiter. But what happened is this company became very big. So as much as I've said, it can be a combination of everything, I just really want to put out there that Pluto Sun opposition, especially some of you may have had Pluto opposite your Sun by transit. It can be a little bit tough, but just sort of putting out there on a business aspect, you can see a lot of problems. And here you go, we can sort of start to bring, there's our combination here, and we know Saturn, interestingly looking at this, I won't go too much into this, but we know Saturn comes in and is going to bring some Saturn stuff. But all these planets have got to go somewhere. But if we can connect them, it's called a little bit of, there's a woman called Grace Morris. A lot of you may know Grace Morris. It's called the magic formula. This is her discovery. So I certainly do not claim to have invented this. But it is really an important part of your astrology practice, looking at astrology yourself, even if you're looking at business, the financial markets, this combination of Pluto, Jupiter and the Sun, and especially the combination of Pluto conjunct Jupiter. In our stock markets, we actually had a day where the Dow went up 1,000 points. It was actually based on, I think, when the news of the vaccine came up. It is all about money. So if you're ever, looking at someone that potentially you may want to do business with or anything like that, and you have something like this, I mean, that's either going to be really beneficial to be with someone in business, but do know they are all about money. And it is just in this case that has been put in the second house and with Bill Gates, but it really probably wouldn't matter where it is because it is such an important part of astrology. Now, we don't just have it by in our charts, we can also look at it in transit. Here I've taken that chart of Pluto, Jupiter and the Sun. Let's just say it's a person. And what we have coming up here is Jupiter trine Pluto. That is a fantastic money transit. The first thing that you would want to do on a chart is have a look, and you can actually use the search, and we can go, when am I going to have Jupiter trine Pluto? It is a fantastic money transit. And it is probably one of the, as I said, the first thing. Now, there will be a Jupiter-Uranus combination, which is about our luck, but Jupiter trine Pluto is about the planet of the great benefactor and Jupiter. Often in this case, it doesn't matter so much whether your Jupiter is retrograde because we're looking at your Pluto, and it even probably doesn't matter too much if your Pluto is retrograde. It is just what we call our money combination. It is one of the best money combinations we can have. And it sometimes doesn't even matter what else is going on because that is a money planet combination. Now we can have Jupiter trine or sextile the Sun, and I'll make a probably trine. I just want to put out there that what we call a trine, which is this triangle, is a little bit stronger than a sextile. Sextiles are always weaker than trines because think of the star here, the sextile, the energy is dissipating all over the place. When we have a trine, think of it like feng shui. There are 3 points and that energy is only moving around 3 points. So it is a lot stronger. It's not to say these sextiles aren't good, they are positive, but it's just a little bit stronger, the trine, just in case you don't know that. So what we can have a look and see, for example, when we have Jupiter trine the Sun, it is certainly a feel-good type event. I'm going to calculate it here. But it is just slightly different. We feel pretty good Jupiter trine the Sun. It is a get out and go kind of thing. But it certainly isn't on the level of Jupiter trine Pluto. Now, of course, the house where our planets are, for example, I'll go back and I'll do a search of this Jupiter trine Pluto here. So here we go, 16th of December 2020. So here's our Jupiter trine Pluto. Now, here in this chart, for example, because Pluto's in the second house, that helps a lot. I will just put it out there that doesn't actually matter too much. We would look on the shape of the Pluto and the setup of the Pluto. Now, interestingly well, you can also look at degrees. So here is even Jupiter and Saturn. We look at the degrees in the chart too. Sometimes your planets do not need to connect. That is really important to put out because the degree is just as important. 29 degrees, 29 degrees. It's just as important. It's a lot better if it connects. And when we have the setup, either by midpoint or in our natal chart, then we ideally do want it to connect in some way via trine, sextile, opposition. But when we're going by transit, it starts to change a little bit. So have a look at the degree. So we have this degree of 29 degrees, 29 degrees, 29 degrees. And when we actually have these sort of Pluto, Jupiter, Sun combinations in transit, and this is also using eclipses, if there was an eclipse at 29 degrees, we might actually think there's something to do with money there. I will just quickly have into my look at my list, bear with me. I managed to find an upcoming eclipse actually that is going to be at 29 degrees. This is the April solar eclipse in Aries. Solar eclipses are even more important. Now, what I want to point out, because we're talking about Pluto, Jupiter, and the Sun, when we have an eclipse, we have the Sun involved. So if we do manage to connect our Pluto, Jupiter, and Sun, say we only had that Jupiter-Pluto conjunction, and I might go back and show an example, we're bringing in the sun by transit into this sort of Pluto-Jupiter-Sun setup. And that is very, very, very powerful. Because if I go back and show you here, here is our solar eclipse, right? It's eclipsing here, but we can also pick up Pluto. There's even a Pluto, trine Pluto here. So if you are a little bit more advanced, and I do, excuse me if this comes across a little bit complicated, but because we're looking at degrees. So here we have Pluto, and then we've got the sun here. But we know on the chart, and this is getting a little, I don't want to get too complicated, because these two form this T-square. So we will actually pick up the pattern. So if you are looking at your own astrology, we don't even have necessarily Jupiter here at the 29 degrees. However, it is connected to the chart. If you don't understand this stuff, don't worry, because we've got to make things for all level astrologers. When we have a pattern in a chart that connects, we know that this something at this 29 degrees will pick up that original pattern. So you can just look, and if this doesn't make any sense to you whatsoever, and I understand that can be a little bit confusing, just have a look at some of the planets in your chart and have a look at any eclipses that come along. And say we had a 24-degree eclipse, you could think, okay, my Venus and my moon would get picked up. And if here, I don't think they actually form a little pattern here as well. Here example, it goes to the nodes, you will pick up all those. But the point is, if you actually, let's have a look at Kris Jenner's chart with that. Here you go. Now this one's quite interesting, this eclipse, because Jupiter's with that. So, this can have themes of abundance, but here you go. Here is our sun, our Pluto, and our Jupiter, right? So that is that example of, and now as an eclipse, it is super, super powerful. And we would probably expect here that there will be something to do with money. So keep a lookout here in 2023 in April. Because here you can see, here's the eclipse trine Jupiter and trine Pluto. Now, obviously these eclipses will be doing other things. So we've got to take that into account as well. However, we would probably think that there is some kind of money event involved here. And I imagine if we actually look at Bill Gates's chart, so here's a little bit of a look into the future, you're going to get the same thing. Now, you do have the eclipse opposite the sun, and that is something completely different here. That is not necessarily great. So it may be, even though it's positive here, there may be a money experience because these planets are forming this Pluto-Jupiter-Sun. But when we bring the sun into eclipses, and that will be another series unto itself, then we start to have a different story. Probably, yeah, I think I'll leave it there for now. So this is really just to demonstrate how we can connect all these Pluto-Jupiter-Sun in various ways. Now here we have Sun square Pluto. That is, quite an intense transit. And it could even be because he has this sort of connection here with, this is just the Jupiter-Pluto. We weren't sort of necessarily bringing it. You could see it wasn't really in his natal chart here connected. But, with an eclipse and stuff like that, that's just putting it out there that, there's sort of these money themes and stuff here. The point is actually just looking at something. Say we had a Pluto-Sun conjunction and we had Jupiter, we would be making Pluto, Jupiter, and the Sun. So, Jupiter would certainly give us a very, very different story going around because Jupiter has a different job than, say, an eclipse. And Pluto in transit then brings a different story. So I want to just go a little bit more into this Pluto trine Jupiter. What I've done is I've come up in a little slightly different transit, and what I've got here is Pluto trine Jupiter. I want to just make clear that Jupiter trine Pluto and Pluto trine Jupiter are two very, very different transits. In the finance markets, we look for Jupiter conjunct Pluto, and I'll show you that in a chart in a minute. Jupiter conjunct Pluto to Pluto conjunct Jupiter are two really different outcomes. Pluto-Jupiter can actually sometimes bring in some really heavy themes. Personally, for me, I'll just put it out there. My mother died on a Pluto conjunct Jupiter. So I really just want you to really understand that Jupiter transits to Pluto are about money. Pluto to Jupiter, now this is a trine, it would probably be a little bit different. The way we would see here, it's not necessarily in a money house, but it is sort of, making this kind of aspect, but it would not necessarily be a money event. Now, a Pluto square Jupiter can bring in, it can be various different themes, because Pluto in astrology rules sex, death, transformation, taxes. You can be things like, maybe you get audited or something on a level like that. And even here you've got this Jupiter square Pluto, and that's what I want to talk about. The difference of Jupiter trine Pluto to Jupiter square Pluto, it is still about money. So what I would suggest to do on your chart, if you are interested in money, you want to have a look at transits of Jupiter square Pluto. These are the days that you do not want to be playing with money. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to bring it in a little bit later here. I'm just searching through. Let's say we're here, and I want to look at the next time on this chart, there will be Jupiter square Pluto. So here I can see it is going to be coming in 2025. What I would suggest is probably use a good half a degree coming. We do have Jupiter conjunct the Sun, but we have Jupiter square Pluto. And this works a little bit differently, what I was saying, that they all just need to connect. As Jupiter trine Pluto is one of or probably the luckiest money transit we can have. And you will have this on a sheet attached, so just, so you might want to get that and put that out. And I'll show you what to do with that in a minute. Jupiter square Pluto, we do not want to invest, not want to say play with money, but we've got to be really careful. We certainly wouldn't do any investments around here, particularly if Pluto is in the second house, maybe the 8th house, and maybe the 5th house. I will go into that in another slide about what houses in our money and our astrology. But we want to stay away from Jupiter square Pluto. Now, even in this example, it's Jupiter opposite Jupiter, Jupiter square Pluto. So we really would want to be, look, we might feel great that day, but our money is going to talk to us in a really different way. So one of the best things you can do, look for Jupiter trine Pluto, even Jupiter sextile Pluto, but we want to stay away from Jupiter square Pluto. And I'm going to show you another transit that we want to stay away from. So I've brought up a chart of what is a really, really successful hedge fund manager, stock investor called Cathie Wood. She's one of the largest, I should say, female stock investors. It's really interesting here that she has, now I've only been able to nominate a time of 12%. We don't tend, 12% of 12 o'clock. We don't tend to rely on house systems when we don't know the exact time, but sometimes we just get it and we can feel it works really well. And this is conjunct the descendant, and the descendant is all about other people. Now here's that Jupiter-Pluto conjunction again. They're within 2 degrees, and this woman is a hedge fund money manager. What's quite interesting actually is that it is forming what we call a kite. There's all these planets that are connected. And when we do have planets connected, you always want to look at a planet, I should say a transit or an eclipse, because it will set off this money here. But this is not what that's about. What I want to show you, this is actually the 8th house of other people's money, which is quite interesting for a hedge fund manager. However, what I want to show you, and look, this is her chart here, and here we go again. Jupiter square Pluto. Sorry, Pluto square the Sun, Jupiter square the Sun. So here we are connecting again in that negative setup. And I imagine if I probably move these around, we will probably connect these straight away. Here is that Saturn coming in, but we have the Pluto Jupiter Sun connect. But don't worry if you can't do the midpoints, because this will give you all you need. It's just showing you that square. I guess in this case, and something I want to show you here, I want to show you a different Jupiter-Pluto transit. Now there's something on, in case you don't know who she is, I'm just going to show you a headline. she's not doing very well. Now, this is written actually as I'm writing this here, and she has some pretty tough astrology. This is February 18, 2022, and I'm recording this actually quite soon. Her really large, it's called an ETF, which is basically what we call a basket of all the companies that she's holding. It's been down 30% this year, and it is down half price, actually more than 1 year ago. I want to actually show you some of her transits because it is such a great thing to see kind of a real world example and an example of someone handling money. And what I want to talk about is Jupiter opposite Pluto. It doesn't matter who you are when it comes to Jupiter opposite Pluto. You are probably going to have a really tough time with money. So it's really quite imperative to have a look at this on your own chart, right? And have a look. And look at, here's this Pluto, and I actually pulled this back to December 2021, right? Here is this Jupiter opposite Pluto. Now, what you've really got to do when you're looking at this stuff, you have to look at what is called a station. Here is Jupiter going back and forwards retrograde, right? Here, interestingly, is Jupiter, Pluto, the Sun, Jupiter opposite Pluto, Jupiter opposite the Sun. I would actually bet my bottom dollar that I could come up, and we look at this legit Jupiter square Saturn. We're going to do a whole other one on Saturn. But when Jupiter is stationing, or particularly Pluto, because if Pluto is doing what we call a station and going back and forth in opposition, say to Jupiter, that's a really tough money one too. When these planets go back and forth, they actually create a story. It's kind of like I call it a grind. And it's even going over what I call her ascendant, while Pluto's on her descendant. But she's going to have Jupiter opposite Pluto and Jupiter opposite Jupiter. This is a really, 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 really tough money transit. Any traders I work with, or when I'm doing a financial consultation, it's called pens down. My clients are not allowed to trade Jupiter opposite or even square Pluto, but the opposition. And when two planets are opposite, what it means is they're sort of screaming and shouting as far away. And what I say in when I'm doing astrological consultations, think of yourself on a football field. You and another friend, you're at exact opposite ends. You're trying to talk to each other. You have to scream at each other to be heard. Now imagine walking through the middle of that conversation. It's going to be really unpleasant because someone screaming and shouting is a really harsh energy. And that's how you can think about when two planets are opposite each other. They cannot communicate, and they actually then communicate really very not well, to the point where it is quite a problem. And that is why oppositions are so tough. And here we come into this Jupiter Pluto Sun setup, where things haven't been very good. So the three top things I want you to look for, and there'll be a sheet with this: Jupiter sextile trine Pluto, Jupiter square or opposition Pluto. They are our money combinations, right? And this, she's really, really had a lot of problems. Now, there is a Pluto square moon, and that is a whole other thing. I'll just quickly throw that in here. She's actually been given a lot of grief from the public, and so be it, when your product has gone down 50%. So to have a combination of Jupiter opposite Pluto, Pluto square moon, it's really, really heavy. Now here's the moon in the second house of money. So you really might want to look at Pluto and see if there's a planet in the second house. It could even be here in the 8th house. Let's have a look here. Here is the square, right, to this sort of 8th house of other people's money. So have a look at Pluto. It is, the Pluto-Jupiter is the real thing, but because Pluto is a bit of a money planet, is about money themes, it depends on the context of you or the person that you're looking at and money. But the real point here, and here's our sun at 27 degrees, so we really have that Pluto-Jupiter sun here, right? So this is what you really want to look at by transit. It doesn't matter whether you have this, what we call magic formula. because particularly when it's negative here, you know, it really does become problematic. But it wouldn't matter if you had a trine and sextile in this combination, it's come in here to bring a little bit of problems. So this is sort of how we use this Pluto Jupiter. When we have Jupiter conjunct Pluto in the sky, if you have a business you want to register, I absolutely suggest, you know, it really helps if you could have Pluto direct, but it doesn't really matter. If you can, you know, if you go through and you have a bit of a search and you might say, you know, what we'll do is we'll go into current transit. So we might want to say, when is the next Jupiter conjunct Pluto? Now we just had one, so it's probably going to be a little while till we have another 2032, right? So it's probably not going to be for a while. Actually, that's not conjunct. Let's have a look about that. Hang on a sec. We had one in 2020, around December 2020. And interestingly, that is actually when the stock market started to really go up really considerably. It was a really, really big transit. So let me just go back here a little bit. We'll get that Jupiter back into Capricorn. Here we are, Jupiter conjunct Pluto. Now I'm going to do a little story on Saturn, but what I would suggest, or probably a little lesson, try and keep Saturn out of the picture. We want these two working on their own. If you're ever going to do like a business chart for someone to nominate, if you want to get into financial astrology that way, we really want to keep these two separate. I consider this Jupiter is the party, Saturn the police. These two cannot work together very well when Saturn is around. Now you also can do, if you are looking at business astrology, you can have, you don't just have to have a conjunction, you can also have Jupiter trine the sun or Jupiter sextile the sun. They show that the business will grow and grow and grow and grow. So let's have a look if I can get here a little bit. For some reason my chart doesn't really like to do these transits very well. Let's have a look here. It doesn't really like to do it very well when I Pluto. Jupiter trine Pluto or Jupiter sextile Pluto, but really try and go for a trine if you can, because it is a little bit stronger, but it won't matter. So, and you can have either or both if you're not able to add them together. But if you can, try and get that Jupiter Pluto Sun connect. And if you have the ability, try and get Jupiter direct, because we want Jupiter working at full strength in a chart. If you have the ability to wait, I really suggest to do so. Jupiter opposite the Sun, you know, I would potentially avoid that unless you are looking for the connect, because if it's all connected, it's okay. If you can create the pattern of like what we call here, this bisextile, even better. So just kind of use your own thoughts. It will take a little bit of experience working with this, but you might even want to go back on your own chart and see when you had Jupiter Pluto Sun involved. So just remember, Jupiter conjunct Pluto, very, very powerful, really amazing, and you are probably going to see lots of money type situations. If you say you had a court case of someone with Jupiter conjunct Pluto, you could be pretty sure that they are all about money. And look, we can't say that for sure, but you know, are they going to back down? Probably not. And they're really strong and direct here. They're working well together. You know, a really strong Jupiter when it comes to business astrology helps a lot. And I would say even Saturn, just probably going to do Saturn a little bit later, but what happens if you have something like a retrograde Jupiter, and for example here, going back into that Jupiter Pluto Sun chart, if I can bring it up, the retrograde Jupiter, what happens? Often we have what we call a Jupiter return, Jupiter conjunct Jupiter. Even this sort of Pluto making that aspect of Jupiter, when Jupiter's retrograde, it doesn't really work as well. Jupiter conjunct the ascendant can turn into a really tough transit. You know, Jupiter expands what it touches. When it's not working so strong, and you might actually see this in your own chart, sometimes a retrograde or a weak Jupiter just doesn't bring us the same rewards. Now, we see a lot of this astrocartography going on. If you move onto a line where your planet is Retrograde, that's probably not going to help you that much. You're better off going on a planet that's strong and direct because you're going to get a better result. Even eclipses, for example, with an eclipse on the Jupiter, if it's retrograde, you can't necessarily bank on this, on it being fantastic. So it's just really important. Now you can hope it might come, but we just don't really get married to the outcome. So that is a little bit about Pluto, Jupiter, and the Sun. So don't forget, you can look for it, and sometimes you'll get it in a couple of different ways, but you can look for it here. When you've got a client or yourself, they actually have the ability to be very, very successful. And when you use this midpoint stuff, you can, this is probably getting too complicated later, but you can then look for, say, when we had Jupiter conjunct this point, we would think there's a really big money event. But just have a bit of a play round, and it is not to say you will not be successful just because you don't have them connected. It's just when we look at a chart to see, from a financial and money perspective, what is that person's setup. They have to bring the free will in there, don't forget. And we have what we call this evolutionary astrology as well, but we can also then go by transit. So what I just want to reiterate, do not play with money, or when I say play, make big investments, watch your money. If you see a bit of, say you've got a 401k, what might happen is that you actually might have a dip that day, and often you'll go back and go, okay, I had Pluto square Jupiter, Jupiter square Pluto, or Pluto opposite Jupiter. So what you might want to do is go into your calendar, and you actually might want to mark out. Now here, example, I've put Jupiter square Saturn. I'm here right now and I'm really not trading or buying, or I could expect maybe, this has made some of my money to go a little bit, so put yourself a little reminder, and then you'll know not to do anything silly with money. So that is a little bit of the first lesson of our money planets, Jupiter, Pluto, and the Sun. So I hope you learned something from that, and welcome to the next lesson when it's time for it to come. Bye-bye.